Hello, I'm Dr. Kirsten Asmussen, Head of What Works, Child Development at the Early Intervention Foundation. This presentation introduces our 10 Steps for Evaluation Success framework. I begin by explaining the EIF evidence standards and how we use them to understand whether or not an intervention works. I then provide a brief explanation of our 10 Steps framework, describing how it can be used to develop and improve the effectiveness of interventions, how it might be used to inform commissioning decisions, and how it can be used to monitor the quality of implementation as interventions are delivered on the ground. Before introducing the 10 Steps framework, however, I think it might be useful to discuss what we mean by early intervention. Effective early intervention works to prevent problems from occurring in the first place, or tackle them head-on before they get worse. Our remit as a What Works organization is to understand the evidence underpinning interventions and activities that aim to support children's development in 7 important domains. These domains include children's physical development, their cognitive development, their behavioral or self-regulatory development, and their social and emotional development. We are also interested in interventions that aim to reduce children's involvement in drugs and alcohol, their engagement in risky sexual behavior, and interventions that aim to reduce child maltreatment. While these are clearly not the only important child outcomes, they are most frequently associated with public health benefits during childhood and adulthood. Studies consistently show that short-term improvements within any one of these 7 domains can lead to benefits throughout childhood and later life. These include improvements in children's physical health and reductions in obesity, improved school achievement and entry into the workforce, reduced crime, violence, and antisocial behavior, and improved mental health and well-being. Clearly, these are not the only important child outcomes, but are widely agreed to provide the most consistent public health benefits. Now let's talk about evidence, starting with the Early Intervention Foundation evidence standards. These standards are broadly consistent with those used by other What Works organizations to assess the extent to which we can be confident that an intervention works. In other words, whether or not causality can be attributed to the intervention model. The EIF standards are expressed in terms of 5 discrete ratings, starting with not level 2, or an NL2 for short, and then running numerically from levels 2 to 4. A 5th category, no effect, is reserved for interventions that have been shown through rigorous evaluation not to have improved any important child outcome consistent with the 7 identified in the previous slide. Our 10 Steps framework breaks down these 5 levels into a set of achievable evaluation steps developers or commissioners can take to establish an intervention's evidence base. Throughout this presentation, I will be describing what these steps are and how they correspond with our evidence standards. However, at this point, I would like to highlight level 3, because this is the point at which we can determine whether or not an intervention works. This judgment can be made because the intervention will have undergone a sufficiently rigorous evaluation, such as an RCT or equivalently robust quasi-experimental study, that has consistently eliminated all biases that could influence a positive or negative outcome. While evaluations at level 2 or lower are not sufficiently rigorous to assign causality to the intervention model, they nevertheless serve a very important role in helping developers and commissioners determine whether an intervention or practice is ready to undergo an evaluation which is sufficiently rigorous to determine causality. Rigorous evaluations are typically expensive, so it is highly wasteful to conduct them unless there is some confidence that the intervention will provide value to children and families and is feasible to deliver. It is also worth saying that many interventions fail to demonstrate any positive child outcomes when they undergo a level 3 evaluation. While this does not mean that the intervention will never work, it does mean that more work is necessary, involving the use of evaluation designs that help determine why the intervention is needed in the first place, who will benefit from it the most, whether or not families will attend it, and how it should be delivered. In our 10 Steps guidance, we describe in detail how this can be done. We also describe the ways in which evaluations can be used to determine whether an established intervention will remain effective every time it is delivered. Now that I have summarized the EIF evidence standards, we can discuss how they correspond with our 10 steps for evaluation success framework. These steps begin by confirming an intervention's theory of change from the perspective of children's development. Once this is understood, providers are in a good position to develop a logic model, create an intervention blueprint, and then conduct a feasibility study. A feasibility study ensures that the intervention can practically be delivered and that children and families will attend it. These first 4 steps represent foundational activities occurring before an intervention is ready to undergo an objective evaluation and are therefore consistent with EIF's Level 2 evidence standard. Once developers are confident that the intervention is feasible to deliver, they are ready for Step 5, when they first objectively measure the intervention's intended outcomes. Activities taking place at Step 5 are consistent with EIF's Level 2 evidence standard. If a positive child outcome is confirmed during Step 5, the intervention is ready for Step 6, the point at which causality can be attributed to the intervention model, as we have described in the previous slide. If the intervention continues to demonstrate positive child outcomes through a sufficiently rigorous Step 6 evaluation, the intervention will have met the criteria for an EIF Level 3 evidence rating. But the evaluation journey is not over yet if developers wish to take their intervention to scale. In these instances, it is necessary to reconfirm the intervention's positive outcomes with a second rigorous study, referred to as an effectiveness trial, conducted under real-world circumstances over a longer period of time. At this point, it is also useful to refine and monitor the intervention to ensure that it remains effective every time it is delivered, as well as adapt the model so it remains relevant when transported to different contexts and cultures. And finally, take to scale through the creation of training models which allow the intervention to be implemented successfully in multiple places at the same time. These last 4 steps are consistent with the EIF's Level 4 rating and are not only useful for those interested in taking their intervention to scale, but also for those commissioning interventions with an established evidence base. Although the completion of these 10 steps represents what we believe to be evaluation success, an intervention's evaluation journey is by no means over, as evaluation activities will have become embedded into the intervention's implementation model to ensure that it remains effective every time it is delivered. Throughout the remainder of this presentation, I will briefly describe the evaluation activities occurring within each of the 10 steps. However, before I do so, there are certain truths about our framework, and evaluation more generally, that are worth highlighting. First, even though the steps are hierarchical, climbing them is essentially an iterative process. This means that for every step you go up, it is likely that you will want to go back down one or more before you go up again. It is important to emphasize now that this will be the rule and not the exception. We also recognize that while the steps are achievable, they can be time-consuming. Additionally, we understand that it is natural for developers and commissioners to be overconfident in the effectiveness of their intervention. Thus, it is very tempting to skip steps. We strongly caution not to do this, as this is the primary reason why interventions fail to confirm positive outcomes when they undergo their first rigorous Level 3 evaluation. We therefore strongly encourage developers and commissioners to go through each successive step, one at a time, in a way that is thorough and systematic. It is also worth noting that our steps are not only for verifying whether or not an intervention works for children and families, but also for determining how the intervention is best implemented and assuring quality as the intervention is delivered. Steps 4 and 8 are particularly important for understanding implementation, as well as establishing monitoring systems as part of ongoing quality improvement cycles. It is therefore likely that you will be revisiting these 2 steps again and again. In addition, it is worth noting that steps are not just for interventions, but also practices if a practice cycle can be identified. Examples of practice cycles include a school year or financial quarter. Finally, It is important to recognize that it is unrealistic to assume that every intervention or practice will make it to the top of this scale. This happens because the steps often reveal shortcomings in the intervention, suggesting that it is not practical or effective. Even in cases where interventions are found to be effective, developers may not have an interest in offering them at scale. Nevertheless, we feel it is important that evaluation systems are in place for determining that interventions remain effective every time that they are implemented, regardless of whether they are available throughout the world or only in one place.